Hello, everybody. Luke Thomas here from Morning Kombat and Showtime CBS Sports with, unfortunately, bad news. Not the worst news in the world, but definitely not good. Okay, so let's get right to it. First things first, though, please give the video a thumbs up, hit that subscribe button. So, what is the news? Why is it bad? And what does it all mean? All right, so here's the news. UFC welterweight Leon Edwards is out of his fight with Khamzat Chimaev for the December 19th card UFC Vegas 17. Why? Because he contracted COVID. That is why. So, that was scheduled to be the main event of that card. That is now off. The initial report came from ESPN's Ariel Helwani. He has subsequently reported, as of the time of the recording of this video, that the UFC is now looking to make originally the co-main event, they'll bump it up to the main, another welterweight contest between Stephen Wonderboy Thompson and Jeff Neal. So still a pretty good main event, and actually still a pretty good card. We'll talk about that in just a second. But first things first, let's talk about that. No one has had a rougher 2020 in terms of just getting their career going, inside MMA anyway, as Leon Edwards. Remember, back in March, when the show that was supposed to be UFC London, the one after UFC Sao Paulo, that was supposed to be a headlining event for him in the UK against Tyron Woodley. Seeing the condition that Tyron's in at the current state of his career, you would think that Leon would have had a pretty good chance of getting that win, which probably would have got him a title shot. I mean, there's just a lot of things where that could have gone really well for him. Now, maybe he would have lost, of course. You can't discount that possibility. But that was a great opportunity, and it was taken away from him. And yes, you could maybe argue that he should have accepted some other fights along the way and that there were some things he could have done to benefit his own situation, but he eventually, through some arm twisting, took the fight with Chimaev. And there's a lot of reasons to dislike that if you are Edwards, but people were interested in seeing it. It was in the main event. I think it would have given him some respect that maybe he hadn't yet earned, depending on your perspective. Certainly some visibility, maybe. And now that has been taken away as well, unfortunately. Now, we don't know if they're going to just try and push the fight a few weeks later. UFC hasn't, again, as of the recording of this video, said exactly what they want to or are going to do about it. So some of that remains unclear. You still may get it, but you're definitely not going to get it on December 19th. So that is the first thing I would say is unfortunate news, in particular for Leon Edwards. As it relates to Chimaev, it takes him maybe out of the running for fighter of the year, depending on how things would have gone. And even then, you may not have put him in that category. But it certainly slows his momentum here a little bit because he was sort of shot out of a cannon with his two fights in Fight Island and then the most recent one in the Apex against Gerald Meerschaert. If he had gotten another one, again, maybe that wouldn't necessarily have crossed him over that finish line for fighter of the year. But certainly he would have had a pretty dramatic turn of events and dramatic popularization of who he is and his name and everything else. So that gets slowed a bit. Again, I don't think in necessarily any kind of fatal way, but it does make things a little bit more difficult for him. So we'll see if they make that fight a little bit later. Maybe they'll keep him on the card and put another fighter substituting in there. It's always a possibility. We don't yet know. Okay, so there's that. Now, the good news is that the card is still pretty good. As I mentioned, it looks like Wonderboy versus Jeff Neal is going to be your main event. Let me read off the rest of this card if I can. You still get Marcin Tybura versus Greg Hardy. That will now be your co-main. Marlon Moraes is back against Rob Font. Great bantamweight contest. Misha Serkinov taking on Ryan Spann. And then the opening bout on that card is Jose Aldo taking on Chito Vera, which is a very good fight. Elsewhere on the card, you have Michelle Pereira versus Chaos Williams, Pantoja versus this sort of new signing from Japan, Manel Kape, I think is how you pronounce it. I could be wrong about that. Bilal Muhammad is on this card. Duran Wynn is on this card. Rick Glenn is on this card. Ayman Zahabi. Sijara Eubanks versus Panny Kianzad. There's a lot of different fights on this card that are actually still pretty good. So the depth of the card definitely still there for now, obviously. But the crown jewel of the whole event no longer with us for that particular event. So if there is some good news, as it stands, if you watch the totality of the event, you will still get a lot from it. I know a lot of folks don't like it when we talk about COVID on the show. In part, the UFC doesn't like it. They want to treat their shows as some kind of respite from the rest of the world. I disagree with that particular strategy, but I also understand that there's a lot of COVID fatigue out there. Believe me, folks. I get it. Some of you are living in states or places where the restrictions are more severe than others. Some of you may have been affected by it. Some of you may have not been affected by it. But either way, it has run over all of our lives in one way or another in the year 2020. About that, there can be no doubt. And so bringing it up all the time it really annoys a lot of people. I get it. But folks, listen, the UFC has had a tremendous year, and they have adapted to these current circumstances in many ways better than any other sports entity, except maybe the NBA, has done. Nevertheless, the outbreak as it currently stands, particularly in North America, is worse than at any point. Our treatment is better, but the spread is worse than at any point, including March and April. Okay? So, and by the way, all estimations are it's going to get significantly worse before it gets better. I keep saying this. You are allowed to believe whatever you want about COVID. You are allowed to believe whatever you want about state regulations. But the reality is, until COVID is contained, we don't go back to normal. And while the UFC has adapted really well, we now have had multiple main events in a row for the UFC affected by COVID. And I suspect we'll have many more. I don't know how far it will reach into the fight cards themselves and how long this will all last. But with the spread being as far as it has been, and all you have to do is contract it for you to lose your fight, you can do some math on this and say it's going to be harder and harder for fighters who even take precautions to protect themselves from this reality. We do not get to go back to normal until this whole thing is contained. Now, the good news is there are some vaccines on the way. Some people might take them. Maybe some states will take some measures that will reduce the spread. There are other forms of smart intervention that will reduce community transmission. I don't really know. But everyone wants to keep speaking out against all the things that people are trying to do to mitigate the spread because they don't feel like that we should have to listen to that. But the reality just keeps being what the reality is. You can like this fact or you can hate this fact, but it's a fact. We don't get to go back to normal inside of MMA or in the broader economy until COVID is contained. There is no normal, there is no recovery, there is no anything until we get it under control. So, knock on wood, MMA and UFC in particular have been lucky, and they've done the kinds of things to create their own luck. But this kind of thing is going to keep happening until it doesn't, and it will be contained only when folks do the kinds of things necessary to contain it. So you can take from that what you want, but it's just the reality that we're all facing. Okay? All right. Thumbs up if you liked it. Subs if you loved it. Morning Kombat tomorrow here, 11 a.m. Me, BC, and you. See you then.